So in this video we are gonna discuss about some short questions of public law, like the topics we discussed earlier in the videos, all in one. What does ECHR stands for? European Convention on Human Rights. When was the European Convention on Human Rights established? It was established in 1950. What is the purpose of the European Convention on Human Rights? Its purpose is to protect and uphold fundamental human rights and freedoms. What does HRA Act 1998 stand for? It stands for Human Rights Act 1998. When was the Human Rights Act 1998 enacted? It was enacted in 1998. What is the significance of the Human Rights Act 1998 in the UK? It incorporates the rights and freedoms outlined in the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law. What role does the European Court of Human Rights play? It is responsible for interpreting and enforcing the European Convention on Human Rights. How does the Human Rights Act 1998 impact the UK courts? It requires UK courts to take into account decisions of the European Court of Human Rights when interpreting legislation. What happens if a UK law conflicts with the European Convention on Human Rights? So, the courts have the power to issue a declaration of incompatibility, highlighting the conflict between the law and human rights. Can individuals bring cases directly to the European Court of Human Rights? Yes, individuals can bring cases to the European Court of Human Rights after exhausting all domestic legal avenues. What rights are protected under the European Convention on Human Rights? Rights such as right to the life, freedom from torture, freedom of expression, and the right to a fair trial, among others. Can public authorities be held accountable under the Human Rights Act 1998? Yes, public authorities are bound by the Human Rights Act 1998 and can be taken to court if they violate human rights. Is the UK obligated to abide by the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights? Yes. As a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, the UK is obligated to abide by the decision of the court. How does the Human Rights Act 1998 affect government policies and legislation? It requires the government to ensure that its policies and legislation comply with the rights and freedoms outlined in the European Convention on Human Rights. Can the Human Rights Act 1998 be repealed? Yes, it can be repealed or amended by the UK Parliament, although this would have significant legal and political implications. What is the process for amending the Human Rights Act 1998? Any amendments to the Act would require approval by both Houses of Parliament and would likely involve public consultation and scrutiny. Does the European Convention on Human Rights cover economic and social rights? Yes, it covers a wide range of rights, including civil, political, economic, and social rights. Can the Human Rights Act 1998 be used to challenge government actions? Yes, individuals and organizations can use the Human Rights Act 1998 to challenge the government actions that they believe violate their human rights. What is the relationship between the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Union? The European Convention on Human Rights is separate from European Union, although European Union member states are required to adhere to the convention. Has the Human Rights Act 1998 been subject to criticism? Yes, the Act has faced criticism from various quarters, including some politicians and media outlets who argue that it has led to controversial legal decisions and infringements on national sovereignty. Moving on to the executive part. What is the executive branch in public law? The executive branch is one of the three main branches of government responsible for implementing and enforcing laws. What are the primary functions of the executive branch? The primary functions include enforcing laws, administrating government policies, managing public services, and conducting foreign affairs. Who is typically the head of the executive branch? In most countries, the head of the executive branch is the president or prime minister, depending on the political system. How does the executive branch relate to the legislative branch? The executive branch often works closely with the legislative branch to propose, draft, and implement laws, and the head of the executive branch may have veto power over legislation. What is the role of the executive in the relation to judiciary? The executive branch is responsible for implementing and enforcing judicial decisions and appointing judges and other judicial officers. Can the executive branch make laws? While the executive branch cannot make laws directly, it often plays a significant role in their lawmaking process by proposing legislation and implementing laws passed by the legislature. What are some examples of executive agencies? Examples include departments such as the Department of Justice, Department of Defense, and Department of Health and Human Services, as well as agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. How does the executive branch handle national security matters? The executive branch is typically responsible for national security matters, including defense, intelligence, and foreign policy, often through agencies such as the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency (CIA). What is executive privilege? Executive privilege is the power of the executive branch to withhold information from the public, Congress, or the courts in interest of national security or the effective functioning of government. How does the executive branch maintain accountability? The executive branch is subject to various mechanisms of accountability, including oversight by legislature, judicial review, and public scrutiny through elections and media. Then the devolution. What is devolution in public law? Devolution is the transfer of power from a central government to the subnational levels such as regional or local governments. Which countries have developed systems of government? Countries like United Kingdom, Spain, and Canada have devolved systems of government. What is the purpose of devolution? Devolution aims to decentralize governance, giving regions or nations more control over their affairs while remaining part of a larger political entity. How does devolution differ from federalism? Devolution typically involves the transfer of power within a unitary state, while federalism involves dividing power between a central government and constituent states or provinces. What are some examples of devolved powers? Examples include education, healthcare, transportation, and certain aspects of taxation. What is the legislative body responsible for devolved matters in the UK? The devolved legislatures in the UK are Scottish Parliament, the Senate or the Welsh Parliament, and the Northern Ireland Assembly. How does devolution affect the role of local governments? Devolution can enhance the role of local governments by granting them greater autonomy and decision-making authority. What challenges can arise from devolution? Challenges include issues of accountability, coordination between central and devolved governments, and potential tensions between different regions. How does devolution impact national identity? Devolution can promote and strengthen national identities within regions or nations, particularly in areas with distinct culture or historical backgrounds. What is asymmetrical devolution? Asymmetrical devolution occurs when different regions within a country have varying degrees of devolved powers. Can devolution be reversed? While rare, devolution can be reversed through legislative changes or constitutional amendments. What is the significance of Scotland Act 1998? The Scotland Act 1998 established the Scottish Parliament and devolved certain powers to Scotland, marking a significant milestone in the devolution process in the UK. How does devolution impact the distribution of resources? Devolution can lead to disparities in resources allocation between regions, raising questions of fairness and equity. What role do evolved administrations play in policymaking? Devolved administrations have the authority to develop and implement policies in areas under the jurisdiction, such as education, healthcare, and transportation. How does devolution influence intergovernmental relations? Devolution necessitates ongoing dialogue and cooperation between central and devolved governments to address shared challenges and coordinate policies. What is the relationship between devolution and constitutional reform? Devolution often accompanies broader constitutional reforms aimed at redistributing powers and enhancing democratic governance. How does devolution impact the concept of sovereignty? Devolution challenges traditional notions of sovereignty by dispersing power within a state while maintaining its overall authority. What are the benefits of devolution? Benefits include greater responsiveness to local needs, increased democratic participation, and the preservation of cultural diversity. What is the role of the Supreme Court in devolution matters? The Supreme Court of the United Kingdom has jurisdiction over devolution issues, ensuring consistency and resolving disputes between central and devolved authorities. How does devolution affect the unity of a country? Devolution can both strengthen and challenge the unity of a country, depending on how it is implemented and managed, and the degree of regional autonomy granted. Now, the judiciary. What is the judiciary? The judiciary is a branch of government responsible for interpreting and applying laws. What are the key functions of the judiciary? The judiciary interprets laws, resolves disputes, upholds rights, and ensures justice. What is the principle of judicial independence? Judicial independence refers to the autonomy of the judiciary from other branches of government, ensuring impartiality and fairness. How are judges appointed? Judges are typically appointed by the executive branch or through a judicial selection process, depending on the legal system. What's the difference between civil and criminal courts? Civil courts handle disputes between individuals or entities, while criminal court adjudicates cases involving violations of criminal law. What is the hierarchy of courts? The hierarchy of courts refers to the structure where lower court decisions can be appealed to higher courts, ensuring consistent interpretation of law. What is judicial review? Judicial review is the power of the judiciary to review the constitutionality of laws and government actions. How do courts interpret laws? Courts interpret laws by analyzing legal text, legislative intent, precedent, and legal principles. What is the significance of judicial precedent? Judicial precedent establishes the basis for future decisions by providing guidance and consistency in legal interpretation. How does the judiciary protect individual rights? The judiciary safeguards individual rights by adjudicating cases involving violations of constitutional or legal rights. What role does the judiciary play in upholding the rule of law? The judiciary ensures the rule of law by applying legal principles impartially and holding individuals and governments accountable. How does the judiciary contribute to the development of law? Through judicial decisions, the judiciary clarifies legal principles, fills gaps in legislation, and adapts to societal changes. What is the alternative dispute resolution? Alternative dispute resolution methods such as mediation and arbitration provide alternatives to traditional court litigation for resolving disputes. What challenges does the judiciary face in ensuring access to justice? Challenges include backlog of cases, limited resources, procedural complexities, and disparities in legal representation. How does the judiciary handle international law matters? The judiciary applies international law through treaties, conventions, and customary practices, ensuring compliance with international obligations. What is the role of the judiciary in constitutional matters? The judiciary interprets constitutional provisions, resolves disputes concerning constitutional interpretation, and safeguards constitutional rights. How does judicial activism differ from judicial restraint? Judicial activism involves judges taking an active role in shaping legal and social policies, while judicial restraint involves limiting judicial intervention to uphold legislative and executive actions. What mechanisms ensure accountability in the judiciary? Accountability mechanisms include judicial codes of conduct, disciplinary procedures, and oversight by judicial review bodies. How does the judiciary interact with other branches of government? The judiciary checks the power of the executive and legislative branches through judicial review and upholds the separation of powers principle. What reforms could improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the judiciary? Reforms may include measures to address court backlogs, enhance judicial training, promote diversity on the bench, and improve access to justice for marginalized communities. Now, UK Constitution and European Union. What is the UK Constitution and is it codified? The UK Constitution consists of statutes, common law, conventions, and treaties. Unlike many countries, the UK does not have a single codified constitution. What is the principle of parliamentary sovereignty in UK? Parliamentary sovereignty means that Parliament has supreme legal authority and its laws cannot be overruled by any other body. How did the UK's membership in the European Union impact the Constitution? European Union membership required the UK to adhere to EU laws and regulations which sometimes conflicted with traditional principles of parliamentary sovereignty. What was the significance of the European Communities Act 1972? The European Communities Act 1972 incorporated EU law into UK domestic law and gave EU law precedence over conflicting UK laws. How did European Union law interact with national law in the UK? European Union law had direct effect and supremacy over conflicting UK law, meaning that European Union regulations and directions were directly applicable in the UK. What role did the European Court of Justice play in the UK legal system? The European Court of Justice had the authority to interpret EU law and resolve disputes between the UK and other EU member states. How did European Union membership influence the devolution in the UK? European Union membership necessitated the devolution of certain powers to devolve administrations such as Scotland and Wales to comply with EU laws and regulations. What are the key principles of European Union law? Key principles of European Union law include supremacy, direct effect, and the principle of conferral, which limits the European Union's power to those explicitly conferred by member states. How did Brexit impact the UK's relationship with the European Union? Brexit, the UK's withdrawal from the European Union, led to the end of European Union law supremacy in the UK and reshaped its legal and constitutional landscape. What mechanisms existed for resolving disputes between the UK and the European Union? Disputes between the UK and European Union were resolved through the European Court of Justice and negotiation processes outlined in the European Union treaties. How did the European Union membership affect the UK's trade and economic policies? European Union membership facilitated trade and economic cooperation with other member states but also constrained the UK's ability to independently negotiate trade deals. What implications did the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights have for the UK? The European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights outlined fundamental rights and freedoms applicable in European Union member states, including the United Kingdom, influencing its human rights framework. How did European Union membership impact the UK's immigration and asylum policies? European Union membership allowed for the free movement of people between member states, impacting the UK's immigration and asylum policies and leading to debates over immigration. How did the UK incorporate European Union directives and regulations into its legal system? European Union directives were implemented into the UK law through domestic legislation, while European Union regulations had direct effect and did not require further implementation. What is the European Convention on the Human Rights and how does it relate to European Union law in the UK? The European Convention on Human Rights is an international treaty separate from the European Union that protects fundamental rights and freedoms. While not an European Union document, it influenced European Union law and was incorporated into UK law through the Human Rights Act 1998. What were the implications of Brexit for the UK's environmental policies and regulations? Brexit led to UK's ability to independently reshape its environmental policies and regulations outside of European Union frameworks, potentially allowing for greater flexibility but also raising concerns about divergence from European Union standards. What is the process for amending the UK Constitution in light of European Union law changes? Amending the UK Constitution in response to European Union law changes typically required legislative action by Parliament, often involving the repeal or amendment of existing legislation. How did European Union membership impact the UK's sovereignty and decision-making powers? European Union membership required the UK to share sovereignty with other member states, particularly in areas governed by European Union laws and regulations, limiting its independent decision-making powers. What was the role of European Union funding and grants in the UK? The UK received funding and grants from the European Union for various projects and initiatives impacting its budgetary considerations and contributing to economic development in certain regions. How does the UK's withdrawal from European Union affect its future relationship with European institutions and legal frameworks? Brexit has reshaped the UK's relationship with European institutions and legal frameworks, leading to negotiations over future cooperation agreements in areas such as trade, security, and law. Separation of power. What is the principle of separation of powers? The separation of powers is a constitutional principle that divides government authority among three branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Why is the separation of power important? It is important because it prevents the concentration of power in one branch, promoting checks and balances and safeguarding against authoritarianism. What are the three branches of government under the separation of powers? The legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch implements laws, and judicial branch interprets laws. What is the role of the legislative branch in the separation of powers? The legislative branch, typically a parliament or congress, drafts, debates, and passes laws. How does the executive branch uphold the separation of powers? The executive branch, led by the government or president, implements and enforces laws, manages government agencies, and conducts foreign affairs. What powers does the judicial branch have under the separation of powers? The judicial branch, including courts and judges, interprets laws, resolves disputes, and ensures the constitutionality of government actions. How does the separation of powers prevent tyranny? By distributing powers among branches, each acts as a check on the others, preventing any one branch from becoming too powerful and infringing on individual rights. What are the checks and balances in the context of separation of powers? Checks and balances refer to mechanisms that allow each branch to limit the powers of the other branches, ensuring accountability and preventing abuse of authority. Can one branch of government perform functions of another branch under the separation of powers? While there is some overlap, such as executive agencies implementing laws, each branch generally has distinct powers and responsibilities. How does the separation of powers operate in parliamentary systems? In parliamentary systems, the executive branch is drawn from the legislative branch, blurring the separation but still maintaining checks and balances through parliamentary oversight. How does the separation of powers function in presidential systems? In presidential systems, the executive branch is separate from the legislative branch, which each having independent powers and responsibilities. What role do independent agencies and commissions play in the separation of powers? Independent agencies and commissions often bridge the gap between executive and legislative branches, performing regulatory functions with varying degrees of autonomy. How does the judiciary ensure the separation of powers? The judiciary acts as a check on both the legislative and executive branches by reviewing the constitutionality of laws and government actions. What role does judicial review play in the separation of powers? Judicial review allows courts to invalidate laws or government actions that violate the Constitution, ensuring adherence to the separation of powers. Can the separation of powers be altered or suspended during emergencies? In times of crisis, some country may temporarily alter the balance of powers, but such measures are typically subject to constitutional limits and oversight. How does the separation of powers promote democracy? By dispersing power among branches, the separation of powers prevents any single entity from dominating governance, allowing for broader representation and accountability. What historical influences shaped the concept of separation of powers? Ideas from philosophers like Montesquieu and Locke, as well as historical experiences with tyranny and monarchy, influence the development of the separation of powers. How does the separation of powers contribute to the rule of law? The separation of powers ensures that laws are enacted, enforced, and interpreted by different branches, promoting legal certainty and limiting arbitrary government actions. What challenges does the separation of powers face in modern governance? Challenges include issues of institutional balance, executive overreach, and maintaining effective checks and balances in increasingly complex political systems. How do constitutional provisions and legal frameworks codify the principle of separation of powers? Constitutions and laws often delineate the powers and functions of each branch, establish mechanisms for accountability, and outline procedures for resolving inter-branch disputes, embodying the principle of separation of powers. And now the public inquiries. What is a public inquiry? A public inquiry is an official investigation established by the government to examine the specific issue of public concern. What is the purpose of the public inquiry? The purpose of public inquiry is to gather evidence, uncover facts, and make recommendations to address issues of public interest or concern. Who typically initiates a public inquiry? Public inquiries are usually initiated by the government, often in response to significant events or controversies. What are the different types of public inquiries? Public inquiries can be statutory, non-statutory, or judicial, depending on the authority and legal framework governing their establishment and operation. How are public inquiries conducted? Public inquiries typically involve hearings, witness testimony, document review, and expert analysis to investigate the matter under scrutiny. What powers do public inquiries have? Public inquiries have the power to compel witnesses to testify, request documents, and conduct investigations under oath. What is the role of the chairperson in a public inquiry? The chairperson oversees the inquiry, ensures fairness, and leads to the panel or commission responsible for conducting the investigation. What are some examples of issues investigated through public inquiries? Examples include disasters, scandals, public health crises, institutional failures, and allegations of misconduct or corruption. How do public inquiries contribute to accountability and transparency? Public inquiries shed light on complex issues, hold individuals and institutions accountable, and promote transparency by making findings and recommendations public. What happens after a public inquiry concludes? After concluding its investigation, a public inquiry typically publishes a report summarizing its findings and recommendations for action by the government or relevant authorities. What factors determine the scope and duration of a public inquiry? The scope and duration of public inquiry depend on the complexity of the issue, the volume of evidence, and the number of witnesses and the resources allocated to the investigation. What role do stakeholders and interested parties play in a public inquiry? Stakeholders and interested parties may participate by providing evidence, making submissions, and engaging with the inquiry process to ensure diverse perspectives are considered. How do public inquiries differ from other forms of investigation, such as criminal trials? Public inquiries focus on examining systematic issues and making recommendations for systematic change, whereas criminal trials focus on determining guilt or innocence and imposing legal sanctions. What are the limitations of public inquiries? Limitations include resource constraints, potential for political influence, limited enforcement powers, and challenges in implementing recommendations. Can public inquiries be challenged or appealed? Decisions made by public inquiries may be subject to judicial review or appeal, particularly if procedural fairness or legal errors are alleged. How do public inquiries address concerns regarding conflicts of interest or bias? Public inquiries are expected to operate impartially and transparently, with mechanisms in place to address conflicts of interest or perceptions of bias among panel members or investigators. What role do the media and public opinion play in shaping the public inquiries? Media coverage and public opinion can influence the conduct and outcomes of public inquiries, highlighting issues of public concern and holding authorities accountable. How do public inquiries inform public policy and legislation? Findings and recommendations from the public inquiries often inform the development of public policy, legislation, and regulatory frameworks to prevent similar issues from recurring. What mechanisms exist to ensure the implementation of recommendations from public inquiries? Governments and relevant authorities may establish oversight bodies, parliamentary committees, or independent monitors to track the implementation of recommendation and hold the decision makers accountable. How do public inquiries contribute to public trust in government and institutions? Public inquiries demonstrate a commitment to the transparency, accountability, and learning from past mistakes, which can enhance public trust in government and institutions by fostering openness and accountability. So this was the video for public law, and I summarized all the parts that I mentioned in earlier videos. So I hope you see this video in a focused manner, and then in your MCQ questions you might get some of them common from here. There is a lot of basic and a lot of background story behind all the laws and all the slides that are mentioned in your coursework. So I advise you to go through them thoroughly, and if there is anything I can help you with, or any questions or inquiries you have in this video, do let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.